Hi everyone, my name is Myra and I am the creator of Zioto Pen. Before we get into working with mediums, I do want to explain a little bit about the Heat Pen. The Heat Pen is lead-free certified, so it is safe to use on any edible medium. It also comes in a beautiful travel size case. And inside your case, you're going to find your Heat Pen along with your instructions. You're going to have 4 ballpoint copper tips and you're going to have 8 silver variable tips. Also, you're going to find a little stand for your heat pen with a little sponge in order to keep your tips clean. Now, we know as cake artists, decorators, that we're always working with items that create a lot of residue. So I always suggest to have a damp cloth next to you because it is important to keep your tips clean in order to avoid residue buildup that will burn on your tip and transfer from one section to the next. Another important thing about your heat pen, you should never ever have to apply an exorbitant amount of pressure in order to work on your medium. The key is to allow the heat to transfer onto the medium you're working with in order to create that softness that allows you to glide smoothly and have a positive result. I have shaky hands, so that's not a problem if you do too. I always allow my hand to rest on the surface I'm working with, and I just glide my heat pen as I am working with it either to the side or towards me. It's very difficult to use your heat pen if you're working up against the medium versus having it glide towards you, because it will cause you to have to force it a little bit, and it can also be a little struggle when you're working with it. You should never have to hold your heat pen this way to work with it because it can damage the core inside and your tip as you're applying pressure going down and working forward. The best results will always be if you just allow your pen to gently rest on the medium and work with it. Now, when you're working with your mediums, you're going to have a variety of different heats because each medium will require a certain amount of heat in order to have it work smoothly with your pen. On your heat pen, you're going to have your on and off switch, and you also have your heat variable knob. It starts at 50 degrees Celsius and goes all the way up to 250 degrees Celsius, which means that you can work on mediums from poured chocolate all the way up to isomalt and everything in between. There are no limits. It's just having the proper amount of heat for the medium that you're working with. Now, we all live in different areas and work with different mediums, so I always advise to start with the lowest amount of heat for the medium you're working with and gradually increase it as needed. Always test your heat pen on the medium before working to make sure that you have the right amount of heat. When you're working with chocolate, I always suggest to start out with 50 degrees Celsius and gradually increase as needed because we all work with different types of chocolate, whether it be compound or couverture. Usually the heat structure for chocolate is between 50 to 80 degrees Celsius. When you're working with fondant, I start between 70 to 80 degrees Celsius in order to stencil and kind of create dimensions. We all know that fondant also varies depending on what brand you are using. So start out with 70 degrees Celsius and gradually increase as needed. There might be times where you might have to go up to 90 degrees Celsius, and that's okay. As long as you're able to work with your medium without any force or strain, that is key. Now, when you're working with isomalt, I always start between 110 degrees Celsius all the way up to 250 degrees Celsius. Now, 250 degrees Celsius is kind of high for isomalt, but if you work fast, then that's the perfect heat for you. If you work slow, then have a lower heat because that means that your pen is going to be setting on your medium a little bit longer than someone that works quickly. So you don't want to overmelt or overheat the medium that you're working with. When you're working with wafer paper, I usually play around, let's say 70 to 80 or 90 degrees Celsius. Again, test your pen on the medium before you start working on it to make sure that you have the proper amount of heat to give you positive results. When you're working with cookies, that is a stronger surface. So I would suggest starting between 100 to 110 degrees Celsius, depending on what you're trying to do. Now, I have come up with a wood burning technique to work on cookies that does require the heat to be a little bit higher so that you can get that wood burning technique. And what I do is I usually outline or stencil my design on the cookie with a heat pin at a lower heat, and then come back with a higher heat and a larger tip in order to get that burning technique. And I do have a full tutorial on that. Let's talk about the tips. One big question I always get asked is, what can you do with each tip? I always suggest to play around with your tips to see what works best for what you're trying to accomplish. For example, if I'm going to stencil something on fondant or a cookie or chocolate, I will use a fine point tip in order to get a really small outline. Then I will come back with larger tips to create more dimension and details. I always suggest play with your tips, learn them, see how they work with your mediums, see which one feels best for you to work with, which one is easier for you to maneuver, depending on what you're trying to do. I've also created 15 tips that are variable sizes, and some are a little bit slanted. These tips are sold separately, and you can create a lot of details with those as well. Now, when you're working with chocolate and fondant, you will need additional tools. For chocolate, I always have soft silicone tips, and I also use these sugar shaper tools. These are the medium. They're not the super soft, and they're not the super hard. I also have a little bit of vodka and a really soft tip paintbrush. And the reason for this is there are areas in chocolate that will be a little bit lumpy, and I always smoothen them out with the sugar shaper tools. I also want to remove all that residue chocolate that I've created with Ziotto with a little bit of vodka and the paintbrush or a soft silicone tip in order to have my surface clean. For fondant, there'll be areas where you are creating different dimensions, and you'll kind of get like a little bit of a groove underneath your tip. I usually use my soft silicone tips for that and kind of smoothen it out and work it up underneath the surface of where I've been stenciling, so my outer part is really nice and smooth. I also have tutorials on these that explain all the details while you're working with the mediums. As I mentioned before, the heat pen works with all kinds of edible mediums, from poured chocolate all the way up to isomalt. So depending on what you're working with, make sure you have the proper amount of heat and enjoy working with your pen.